Our lives are laid out on a road of bumps, turns, struggles, and more. How do we respond? How do we endure adversity for learning and growth? I'm Aubrey Johnson, and we'll explore these questions and more on the road to rediscovery. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of the Road to Rediscovery. I'm your host, Aubrey Johnson. The Road to Rediscovery is about reflecting on life lessons to learn and grow from them, and of course, take it to the next level, pay it forward, and help others who are struggling through dark times. Now, as you know, on the Road to Rediscovery, we are very passionate about delivering quality content that is of value to you and your personal growth. If you like what you hear, please feel free to visit www.roadtorediscovery.com/donate. That's road, the number 2, rediscovery.com/donate. We'll give you a shout out in a future episode. And as always, there is no obligation. We are truly, truly grateful for your listenership. While serving a 14-year mandatory minimum federal drug sentence from 1985 to 1999, my special guest developed an empowerment model called radical responsibility, which of course we'll unpack in this conversation. Today, he's an author and renowned growth mindset and meditation teacher, delivering his training programs worldwide. He's also the founder of the Prison Mindfulness Institute and the National Prison Hospice Association. Oh, and he's also a Roshi, that is Zen master. It's an absolute pleasure to have him on the show. Can't wait for a great conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Dr. Fleet Maull to the show. Dr. Maull, it's so great to have you here, sir.
It's great to be here, Aubrey. Thank you for having me. And I loved your introductory video there. I love it. The whole road to discovery. I love it.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. Thank you. We're very pleased to have you here. So, if you don't mind me asking, I'd love to start out for the benefit of the listeners. Can you paint the picture or take us to when the beginning of this sentence that I just mentioned in the intro took place from a mindset standpoint? Like, how are you feeling? What were you going through? Did you feel there was any sense of hope? And then from there, what sparked your inspiration to go in the direction towards discovering radical responsibility?
Yeah. Well, as we get into it, I'll probably need to give you a little more backstory, but let's start right at the sentencing, or the night before. So I had been in pretty much of a hellhole of a county jail for about 6 months, going through trial.
Mm-hmm.
And awaiting trial, going through trial, and it was a little small town way south of the big city where my trial was happening, and I was in a tank that held, I think, 8 prisoners in 2-man cells, and had no windows. It was a big steel box, and it was summertime, and it was blistering hot. It was really a terrible place, and constant noise, and it was really quite a place. And at any rate, I'd been there all that time, and then I went through trial, and I was convicted on all accounts, and then I was awaiting sentencing, and they actually brought me to the major city where my sentence happened in St. Louis, Missouri, and having a different jail. And the night before my sentencing, they had me in a suicide watch cell. I wasn't suicidal. I was certainly very concerned because I was being threatened with anywhere from the one count that I've been convicted of carried a sentence of anywhere from 10 to life with no parole. So whatever you got, that was it. And especially if you got a life sentence, the only way out would be a presidential pardon, and that's not going to happen unless you're really wealthy or connected, obviously. So, I was concerned, to say the very least. I kind of felt like my life was over. I was 35 at the time. I knew I was going to do a lot of time one way or the other. And so I couldn't sleep at all. And I was in this tiny little cell with all concrete and steel. And somewhere, not long before dawn, I just had this need to look out. And there was a little window up high. So I stood up on this kind of stainless steel toilet sink thing and was able to peer up and just look out this small window and see the stars in the night sky.
Hmm.
and that gave me some relief. And then I climbed back down, and as I sat down in the bunk in that cell, this kind of wave came over me, and I just felt this really solid commitment arise in me that I would not give up, no matter what happened the next day. I would not give up. I wouldn't give up on myself. I
Hmm.
wouldn't give up on my son, who was 9 years old at the time, and
Hmm.
I wouldn't give up on life. And I was very grateful for that experience. I then, later that day, I got sentenced, and I was sentenced to 30 years with no parole. And I'd been hoping for maybe 15, 10, 15, 20. And when the judge said 30 and hammered the gavel down, my knees buckled a bit. My lawyer had to hold me up. I pretty much thought my life as I'd known it was over with.
Yeah, yeah. My goodness, man. I mean, I, I, I can't fathom to even imagine what that feeling is like. I mean, it's overwhelming, you know. And man, that's tremendous, Dr. Maull. It's tremendous. So you were talking about looking at that glimmer of of the night sky, through the small opening, and having that sense of hope. Was that temporarily diminished after the judge laid the gavel down, or did you still have that flame, even though your knees buckled because of the impact of that moment in time? You still have that flame for not giving up on yourself, not giving up on your son. How did you
Yeah,
surge forward with that?
yeah, I think that certainty was there.
Hmm.
But I went through a very intense emotional experience.
Sure.
Uh, you know, uh, in the holding tank courthouse, I'd seen, other men coming back. It was a male holding tank. They probably held women prisoners in a different tank anyway. So
Hmm.
I saw men coming back from sentencing,
Hmm.
breaking down in tears, and I saw U.S. Marshals making fun of them.
Oh,
And,
wow.
I just had said, I'm not going to give them that opportunity.
Yeah.
So, I was absolutely devastating, knowing what I'd done to my son, that my
Hmm.
son was going to grow up without a dad.
Hmm. Hmm.
And, I just shoved the tears down, and
Yeah.
I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. And I went back into the tank, and eventually was transferred back to that hellhole of a small town county jail uh, that night. And I remember being late at night up in my bunk, not being able to sleep again. I didn't sleep much during that whole 7 months, to tell you the truth. It
Mm.
was constant bedlam and noise 24 hours a day in that county jail.
Wow.
And but I was up late at night and just incredibly disturbed,
Hmm.
and I really wanted to let the tears come,
Hmm.
and they just wouldn't come. I had kind of shoved them down so hard they just wouldn't come. And a jail's really no place to cry anyway. But
No, it's not.
I really wanted access, but I just couldn't access it. And,
Hmm.
I really then went through a real dark night of the soul around what I'd done to my son primarily. I was absolutely devastated. I'd had so many internal justifications justifying what I've been involved in and doing all those years, and meanwhile thinking that I love my son, and that I'm a good dad, and I just had to face the fact that I've been making so many selfish decisions for so long and putting my son's life at risk and his mother's life at risk,
Yes.
and I had to face that and face the consequences of it, that now my son was essentially going to grow up without a dad. The next morning in the paper, it said I would be 65 before I had any chance of release. And I learned later, once I got to the federal prison, it really took a month or two, and I kind of got and figured out how the whole sentencing thing worked. And fortunately, I was sentenced under what they call the old law in the federal system prior to 1987. And then at that time, even they did have parole then, but I was convicted of a no parole sentence. So if it had been parolable, I would have gone to the parole board after serving 1/3. It wouldn't didn't mean I would necessarily get paroled, but I'd
Right.
have the opportunity.
Right.
But I had a no parole sentence. But you did receive a lot of good time by staying out of trouble. So on a sentence longer than 10 years, you got 10 years, 10 days a month statutory good time if you stayed out of trouble. So you could subtract that off the back end of your sentence,
Mm.
and that was your statutory release date. And then if you just kept a job while you were there, you didn't have to do a good job. If you just kept a job in prison, you got another 5 days a month that you accrued as you went along. So once I figured all that out, I figured on that 30-year sentence, if I stayed out of trouble and kept a job, I would serve 18 and a half. Now that still felt like forever at that time.
Sure.
Uh, and then later it took my appeal. I appealed my conviction, obviously, as everybody does. And I actually I wouldn't have gone to trial if they hadn't charged me with this one count of, it's called continuous criminal enterprise, the so-called drug kingpin statute, which I didn't feel I was guilty of.
Hmm.
If they had just charged me with the other counts, I would have just pled guilty and put myself at the mercy of the court.
Hmm.
But I went to court. I went to trial because of that reason. And at any rate, on appeal, they did drop one count, not that count, but they dropped another count, which reduced my aggregate sentence from 30 down to 25.
Hmm.
But at that point, I knew I would serve 14 and a half if I stayed out of trouble. Of course, I had no guarantee of staying out of trouble because trouble was around every corner in prison,
Hmm.
right? But at
Yeah.
any rate, I did end up serving 14 and a half.
Amazing. Amazing. And one thing that I guess is a theme that kind of resonated with me as you were explaining all of this, Dr. Maull, is it's what I call one of the four cornerstones to personal growth, um, uh, and it's self-awareness. I have these four cornerstones: self-awareness, gratitude, humility, and service to others. But self-awareness seems to have played a tremendous role in um, well, in your life overall, but specifically during this time. You were saying that you were thinking about what you did to your son. You were thinking about what you did to your family, what this means, for you, and live, existing in this institution. What can you break down for us what how important self-awareness was to you at that time, and um, did self-awareness play a role in your discovery of mindfulness and meditation?
Yeah, absolutely. And at that point, I mean, I realized I had completely torched my life. I'd burned it to the ground, the life I'd known, and I'd
Hmm.
let down my family and my teachers and my community, but most of all, what I'd done to my son, and to myself as well. And self-awareness was huge. But now I need to cycle back and give you a little of the backstory, which is kind of unusual in my case.
Hmm.
So before I went to prison, I'd been deeply involved in a path of self-awareness for 15 years.
Mm.
I got interested in Buddhism and Buddhist meditation back in the late 60s, even more so in the mid 70s.
Hmm.
And uh, by 1976, 77, I had really, even before 75, really, I'd really embraced the path and
Yeah.
got more and more deeply involved in it. And which begs the question, how the heck did I end up in prison?
Right.
Suffice it to say, I was pretty thick-headed and I was successful in compartmentalizing my life.
Yeah.
So I was very involved in this Buddhist path. I'd gone back to graduate school, got a master's degree, did a very intensive 3-year clinical training program
Hmm.
in Buddhist and Western psychology, but it was
Hmm.
a program designed to work with people with severe mental illness, and it was a very powerful program. And I learned a lot. A lot of what I learned still serves me today. And I had did a lot of retreats. Traveled a lot with my meditation teacher, who was a renowned Tibetan meditation master.
Hmm.
I received a lot of training. I was trained not only as a meditation practitioner, but as a teacher, or at least an instructor. And so I had all that background when I came to prison. But I had all these justifications because I was a very angry young man. Went into the counterculture head on. Had all this big hole in my gut from early alcoholic family stuff, and was trying to fill it with every experience you could imagine. And
Hmm.
and then left the country as an expat because I was just angry and alienated about everything. And then
Hmm.
justified falling into small scale drug smuggling as a way to live outside the system. And
Hmm.
the system and the world's hypocritical. And I felt I had all these internal justifications. And
Hmm.
as I got more involved in that Buddhist meditation path,
Hmm.
I realized there was a complete cognitive, not cognitive dissonance. It's just, black and white, but I self-medicated around that. And
Hmm.
I was in denial around it. And I
Hmm.
knew I had to get out of that world. But before I could get out and untangle myself, I earned my way into that federal prison sentence. So when I did get there, and the devastation that hit me around what I'd done to my son and myself and so forth, that completely woke me up, and I became radically dedicated to get all the negativity out of my life and take all the good that I've been given and that I've received and really do something with it. And I became really passionately determined. I didn't know whether I was going to survive prison. I had no certainty that I would survive the time in prison, but I wanted to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even his dad died in prison. And I became passionately dedicated to that. And I also knew that although in terms of the Buddhist meditation path, I'd mostly been interested in the mind stuff, the awareness stuff, right? And I'd been giving short shrift to the ethical foundation of that path. I'd really been ignoring that. And so I decided that my life in prison was going to be completely grounded and the ethical principles of the Buddhist path. And also, I realized once I got into that really intense, crazy environment of the federal prison, which I can talk about in a moment, it was a very unique federal prison. Um, I realized that anything I'd be able to do of value there would come out of my practice. It wasn't going to kind of come out of talk or thought. It was going to come out of walking the talk and really practicing. So I was practicing like my hair was on fire. I was just totally dedicated. I really lived for those 14 years the life of a very dedicated kind of prison monk, but one who was also very engaged in that community, trying to show up and add value.
That's tremendous. I mean, and that had to have been a thin line to walk, right? A balancing act, basically, to kind of mentally relax your brain, your mind, and have some degree of peace by using the practices of what you've learned and studied, in Buddhism, and like you said, being a prison monk. For your own inner sanity, right? But at the same time, being connected with the community and having or being the example for others, in terms of just model inmate, um, um, good behavior, no provocation, those sorts of things. And you touched on radical responsibility, and it seems like this is where the birth of radical responsibility started. As far as that model, is that around the time frame when
Yeah, absolutely. And
okay.
you're right. It was a thin line to walk because you know the prison officials, they just expect you to act like a convict and a
Right.
thug, and and they're
Yeah.
actually even more comfortable with you if you're kind of just a regular convict and getting in trouble, because they just can regard you as
Yeah.
and if you want to get along with your fellow prisoners and fit in, then you use the MF word every other word in every sentence, and
Yeah.
and you act like a convict and act like and you get along, right?
Yeah.
And I wasn't doing any of that. I was real clear. My fellow prisoners, they were my community,
Yeah.
and the prison, the guard, the correctional, that's them. I wasn't demonizing anybody, but I was real clear where my community was and what side of the fence I was walking on.
Right.
But at the same time, I wasn't, people didn't quite know what to make of me because I wasn't going along with the program exactly.
Hmm.
But what I saw when I got there, I mean, first of all, this is a maximum security federal prison hospital,
Okay.
and it's where they bring all the patients they bring there. There were 600 medical patients, 400 psychiatric patients, and about 300 what they call general population or work cadre inmates like myself, who were there
Mhm.
just to help run the place, to work in carpentry, welding, housekeeping, the
I see.
kitchen, food service.
Yeah.
I got a job in the prison school because I had an education. So
Mhm.
somebody, when I got there, they said, go get a job somewhere. They're going to put you in the kitchen. So they said, you got to go to the school. So I went to the school, and they gave me a job as what they called being a tutor.
Mhm.
And so that was my day job for 14 years, teaching school, helping men learn to read, helping men get their GED, teaching English,
Mm.
ESL,
Mm.
and so forth, tutoring people on college classes. So that was my day job for 14 years, very rewarding part of my life and a big learning experience as well.
Oh yeah.
But when I got there, and when I remember the first day I got there, first of all, it was a big relief to get to this big place. There were like 10 buildings, all connected by these underground tunnels. You
Mhm.
could walk around. There were prison yards to get out there. There was a rec room. And compared to this, little hellhole of a county jail I've been in, it was a big relief. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing men being guided around who are blind, men being wheeled around completely emaciated from AIDS and cancer,
Hmm.
men who are paraplegics, quadriplegics. I mean, it was like something out of a Fellini movie. And
Wow.
men doing the Thorazine or Halidol two-step coming out of the psych ward. It was
Yeah.
like, but what I really recognized was not so much the bizarreness of it, but the suffering. And fortunately for me, because when I got there, as you can imagine, I was pretty wrapped up in the drama of my own situation. I just got this 30-year no parole sentence. I was 35 and they said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. So I was pretty self-absorbed in the
Hmm.
drama of my own situation. But
Hmm.
when I saw all this suffering, it completely woke me up. And the influence of my spiritual teacher, who was someone who, as far as I could tell, just 24/7 served humanity,
Hmm.
and a good background I had for my family, although my family had, alcohol problems and so forth that created a lot of problems for me. At the same time, they were basically good people with good values. So, that kicked in and I realized, okay, I just got to show up here and find a way to serve, right? So
Right.
that kind of woke me up. And then, but the other thing that I saw was that I was in a world of tremendous negativity, tremendous negativity. Like you'd
Hmm.
meet another prisoner, and the kind of the ritual was, you'd go for a walk after lunch or dinner or something out on the track. There was in the main yard, there was a big track that went around a softball field, and then there was a basketball court over here. And you got and walked the track, and either one of you would start first and share your victim story, and then the other would share the victim story, because everybody in prison has a victim story. They all feel like they've been victimized, right?
Yeah.
And in many cases they have. Most of
Hmm.
the people that end up in the criminal justice system have been terribly victimized in their childhood, most of them. But at
Right.
any rate, their victim stories are not about that. Usually it's about their fall partner screwed them over, or their lawyer screwed them over, or
Hmm.
the judge did this, or
Yeah.
and so they tell their story, you tell their stories. I did that a few times, and I didn't want to
Hmm.
hear after one or two, I didn't want to hear my story again at all. I
Right.
didn't really want to hear their stories, which wasn't very compassionate of me, but I just didn't want to live there. And fortunately, I had enough background and training that I knew that this was a really negative environment with people walking around with big victim stories and a lot of anger and bitterness. And that's normal. I can appreciate it because when you get arrested, from the minute of your arrest, it's a shaming process and you're just being buried and demonized under a mountain of guilt and shame. And
Yes.
so you instinctually go, just to protect yourself, to survive kind of mentally, psychically, emotionally, you armor up with your victim story, but also with anger and bitterness and so forth. And so it was an incredibly negative environment. And I knew I didn't want to walk out of prison that way. If I was lucky enough to survive, I didn't want to come out angry and bitter with a big victim story, but I
No.
didn't even want to live that way while I was there. Right. So I
Yeah.
knew that I had to very proactively do something or I would end up that way because that's the world I was in. So I realized that I had to embrace 100%, even 200% ownership for having got myself into that situation and for what I was going to do with it and whether I'd ever have any chance of doing something positive with my life in there or beyond prison if I would survive and get out someday. I realized I had to take absolute responsibility for that. And I had lots of people. I mean, when you get prosecuted by the federal government on drug trafficking, they don't play by the rules. They play hardball. They don't care. They lie, cheat, steal, break all the laws. They play hardball and they make no bones about it. And I think I was over prosecuted and all kinds. And plus, I became the designated kingpin because the way they do, these, drug trials, anybody that's involved in any kind of sale of drugs, you're connected to a whole bunch of people one way or the other, right? And so they make deals with everybody, and the person who won't cooperate, you become the kingpin, and everybody else cooperates against you and testifies against you. And I refused to testify, not because I was trying to be a stand-up guy, but my Buddhist values just didn't line up with I had always never intended to do that, and my main partner didn't do it either. My main associate, who had been my buddy, my partner in those activities. So we both ended up doing a lot of time, and we did a lot of people's time. We probably did 30 or 40 people's time, right?
Oh,
And
sure.
and but I chose not to focus on that. I said, I just realized focusing on any of that's going to be a complete waste of time. In fact, I had some very seemingly close friends. I would call them more like associates today, who really stuck the knife deeply in my back. And I decided I don't want to, I want to dissolve any enmity I feel towards them as soon as I possibly can. I certainly don't want to walk out of prison with any of it. And we have a practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition called exchanging self for other on the medium of the breath. It's called Tonlin. And I actively did that with those folks. And I got to the place where I didn't hold any enmity or grudges or anything resentment toward anyone. And I don't today. In fact, I'm just grateful for everything I've ever received from anybody. I really have deep regrets about the impact of what I did and that serving that time had on my family and my son and so forth. But other than that, I'm really grateful for everything I received and the opportunity I had to transform myself. So, but I just saw this I wasn't being heroic. I just saw this was the only way out. I had to embrace this total ownership for the choices I'd made, for what I'd got myself into, and the choices I was going to make today, and where that was going to lead me. And that's really where the radical responsibility uh, approach was born for me.
Amazing, amazing. A tremendous, absolute, enormous amount um, of of self awareness, as well as self accountability, that you've practiced during this time, during this process. And you're right, Dr. Maull. I mean, these victim stories, to me, it seems like a vicious cycle, right? When the inmates talk about their victim stories, and not having the self awareness to hear yourself when you tell every inmate that you run into in the institution your victim story, and then I think incrementally, as you tell the victim story, your bitterness grows more and more and more and more, and it's a vicious cycle, because over time you kind of let that define who you are, when when there's so much more potential, um if if self-awareness ever uh was around, or possible.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for sharing and being quite transparent with what you were going through. You painted a very vivid picture of your time in prison, how you got the job in the school, which is far better than the kitchen, I would imagine, and then the mood and mindset of your fellow inmates. Um, when when did you decide to hold these training classes? Was this something that was part of what you did before sentencing, or maybe was it after you were released? Or did you practice and help others um, within the system?
Yeah, I think I've been a natural teacher in many ways.
Hmm.
It's kind of natural instinct to share what I learned, to learn something and then share it.
Hmm.
I'm not sure why, but I think that's just kind of part of who I am.
Hmm.
In the prison, of course, I worked as a school teacher for 14 years, and I learned a lot because I was the guys I was teaching were my fellow prisoners, and we lived up in dorms, and even if we had a cell, it took me 2.5 years to get into a single cell, one of the few single cells on the floor. I lived on a floor that was originally a medical floor designed for 50 patients, and we had anywhere from 175 to 190 men living on that floor
Oh my
normally. No
gosh.
air conditioning in the summer, so it was just a pressure cooker for all kinds of violence and stuff.
Sure.
And we had no locks on any of the doors, so the littlest guy on the floor in the middle of the night when you're sleeping can wrap a lock in a sock, and you're dead, right? So
Yeah.
you got to deal with people and learn to work with people, and in the school, if you in any way try to express any sense of authority in relation to another prisoner, it's like, what are you, the police? I mean,
Yeah.
you're right. So, and a lot of my fellow tutors, the inmate tutors as they were called, we actually did all the teaching. There were staff instructors in there, but they mainly opened and closed the doors, right? It was
Yeah.
we did the teaching,
Yeah.
but most of the tutors, they'd go over and sit in a desk in the corner, and they tell the guy, "Hey, you want some help? I'm over here to help you, but other than I'm
Hmm.
not going to bother you. You're cool, I'm cool."
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I just didn't want to do that. This was my life, and I wanted to help people, and I really wanted to teach, and I did a lot of classroom teaching, and to get up in front of a classroom and teach, and with teach one-on-one and classroom style teaching as well, you got to exercise a certain amount of classroom control. Well, that's just complete opposite of what you can do in that environment. So I had to figure out how to get in relationship with people enough that they would let me encourage them and push them a little bit to learn. And for many of these guys, their memories of school was a nightmare, and
Hmm.
they were being forced to go to school because if they didn't have a GED, they had to go to school, and if they refused, they went to the hole. And a lot of
Hmm.
times they would refuse and go to Ad Seg or the hole, get locked up for a week or 2 weeks. then they'd have to come back and go back to school anyway. Now they're more pissed off, more angry, right? And if they did
Right.
to go back, some go back for 3 or 4 times,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
here they are. They're staring at me. I'm staring at them, right? And they're like,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
who you are, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
No.
I had to learn, I screwed up a couple times, got into some really, potentially dangerous situations once or time, but I'm a quick learner. And I really learned that I had to really patiently get in a relationship with each guy and get to
Hmm.
the point where through humor and relationship, I could, and I ended up helping a lot of people learn to read or get their GED, and a lot of appreciation. And it also connected me across because prison is a very racially divided environment.
Yes.
When you went up in what they call the chow hall, the dining hall, there were two sides. There was like a salad bar line down the middle. There were two lines. You could either in inside, you go through either two of cafeteria lines, right? Same, they had the same food. You go through this side, and then you come back down the middle, the salad bar, and that's divided. All the white prisoners sat on one side, all the black prisoners sat on the other, and the Latinos would sometimes sit on either side, right? And
Okay.
the
Yeah.
Asians mostly sat, I think, on the white side. There weren't that many Asians, sometimes some. And at any rate, I was one of the few prisoners that ever sat over on the other side with the black prisoners. I didn't do it all the time, but I did it periodically. And I
Hmm.
had a lot of friends, and because I taught school, I was working with a lot of black guys, a lot of Latinos, and I was helping a lot of Latinos from Mexico learn English. And also, I played basketball, which was unusual there, and so I was one of the few white guys playing basketball. So I was more connected with the different communities than almost anybody there, especially for a white guy. But I still had to be careful, know where I was and who I was talking to, because there was times when it's, hey, yeah, I know you were connecting. There are other times when you're kind of around that it's all, don't
Yeah.
put me on Front Street. I don't know you. So
Yeah.
you had to work with those kind of sensitivities all the time. But anyway, I learned a lot teaching school, and then I also got very involved in 12-step work because I knew I had issues around alcohol and drugs, and so
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
got very involved in the 12-step work and became a leader in that and did that for 14 years. And I was always getting other guys into the leadership position, going into the background. But most guys were only there for a year, year and a half. Nobody wanted to stay at that place because of the federal hospital. They wanted to get transferred, get closer to home. So, I cycled through a lot of guys, but I was, the mainstay in the background of that group for 14 years. And so, a lot of leadership there. And then I helped start the first hospice program in a prison anywhere in the world, as far as we know. Another inmate and myself got inspired to do something about the incredibly horrible, really criminally negligent conditions that men were dying in there. And this was the height of the AIDS epidemic. And the
Oh my gosh.
the patients here were brought from all the federal penitentiaries. It was
Yeah.
a max. There's other federal prison hospitals, but this is the maximum security one. So the
Hmm.
patients, whether they were psychiatric or medical, were from like Lewisburg and Lompoc and Atlanta, from all the federal penitentiaries. They're really scary places, right?
Hmm.
And so uh, and they were there dying in horrible conditions. So another inmate and myself worked for a long time to get the staff to finally go for it. And we got a hospice program started and got outside people to come in and train us to be hospice volunteers. That was a huge part of my life for the last 11 years of my time, where I
Wow.
spent most of my meal breaks, a lot of my evening time, weekend time up in the hospital caring for guys who were dying. And we'd be assigned to particular patients. So you'd stick with one guy, through to his death. A few guys got out, but most of them died there. And, that was incredibly transformative for a number of reasons. One, you're faced with your own mortality because a lot of my patients were younger than I was.
Yeah.
Some were older, some were my age, but I know there, but for the grace of whatever you believe in, go you.
Yeah.
And also, I saw men in the general population there get sick and end up in the hospital and die there. In fact, we had two hospice volunteers who were healthy hospice volunteers in the general population, just like myself, get sick, become hospice patients, and die there.
Oh
Right.
my.
One of them was a close friend of mine, and the other became my patient. Right.
Yeah.
So, you're really confronted with your own mortality. And then the other part of it is that in doing that kind of service work, you're putting your own needs aside and
Yes.
putting someone else's needs in front of your own in a really
Yes.
powerful way.
Yes.
And that is one of the most transformative things you can ever be involved in, to actually, be compelled enough to really focus on someone else's needs, not at the expense of your own, but just, this is their time. So leave me outside the door. I'm here to really support and serve this person. And making that shift is, one of the most transformative things any of us can do, right? To help get us out of that kind of egocentric way most of us start out, and certainly the way I'd been. So, I was doing all that, and I really helped design the education program, the training program, and I was running the training program for the hospice program, and so I was teaching there. I was a leader in the 12-step work. I was teaching in school. I started a meditation group that ran twice a week, so I was teaching meditation. So I was teaching and training the whole time I was in prison, and I
Mhm.
learned a lot. And I also studied, did a lot of research. I almost finished my PhD while I was in prison. So I was really training myself. I knew when I got out, once my sentence was reduced from 18 and a half to 14 and a half on appeal, I knew that if I managed to stay out of trouble, I'd be just short of my 50th birthday when I got out.
Right.
And it's pretty tough to start a life when you're 50, especially when you got a record as a serious, offender. And
Right.
also, the IRS had a $300,000 judgment against me related to, charge me taxes on the drug smuggling I'd done.
Mhm.
And so, I knew I was going to be in a tough spot when I got out, and I knew I had to really focus on training myself. And so I did. I tried to add as much value as I could while I was there, but I was really training myself for any possible future, and that really paid off. So I think when I came out, I was a pretty well trained teacher, and I also ended up becoming a business management consultant coming out of prison, and which is seems smoke and mirrors, but in some ways, learning how to get things done in an environment where you're completely powerless. It's a totalitarian environment where the staff, they have all the power, and if you resist it, and you're in 4-point restraints on a concrete bunk being hosed down at night. So how do you get anything done in that environment? So I really had to learn how to be skillful. And so I think that 14 years really was the training that's allowed me to do everything I've been doing for the last 23, 24 years around the world.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was I was going to ask you and have you bring us to the time when you were released, when you got out, and putting us in that seat, of what you were feeling, what you were thinking and going through. And I mean, I'm sure there's some excitement and there's some, like, hey, I am free now. But at the same time, sounds like you had a very realistic view of knowing that, I'm going to have some challenges against me in the real world, starting life outside at 50, along with, having a record of this size and feeling like cards were stacked against you. But, um, it's amazing how the good practices that you have demonstrated in that environment has paid dividends outside that environment. Would that be accurate in saying?
Oh, absolutely. And, I want to say, I remember I was interviewed several times while I was in prison. I was interviewed on NPR one time
Mm,
around the hospice work and other things. I'd been publishing some things and
yes.
publishing some research and so forth, and getting a little notoriety, which the prison didn't really appreciate very much, actually. But at any rate, I remember being asked, one time, it seems like this prison situation has been pretty good for you. It's actually really served you in terms of been very transformative for you. And I said, absolutely, but I want to make this really clear. For most prisoners, it's really destructive. Most people come out worse than they went in. I was really fortunate that I came in with a lot of training already, and this woke me up, and I was able to creatively use this time in this situation. But I did that myself, not to pat myself on the back, but this place is not set up to heal people,
Right.
right? And
Right.
and it doesn't. And most people come out much worse than they went in.
Mm,
So not everybody, but the majority
yeah.
really. And it's a very incredibly inhumane, disempowering, institutionalizing, trains you to be helpless, trains you to be a victim.
Yeah.
It on a good day, you maybe only have a half dozen really demeaning encounters with either the correctional officers or your fellow prisoners. I mean, just demeaning, where you feel your humanity is just
Sapped
completely
out.
under assault. Just
Oh yeah.
those
Mhm.
dehumanizing experiences. On a good day, maybe you only have six. So it's a really
Oh my
negative
gosh.
environment. And it was only because of my internal practices. And,
Hmm.
I was meditating 3 hours a day and longer on weekends and doing all these internal yoga practices from my
Right.
tradition. And so I got to the place where I was living in a very positive state,
Right.
even in this crazy world. But that's not, most prisoners didn't have access to that, right?
Yeah.
So when I did get out, um, one of the things I hoped for was that I would get out and my parents would be able to see me out of prison and okay, right? And they'd be finally have that relief and that joy. Well, my father ended up dying 5 months before I got out. And
Hmm.
as he was getting near death, my family was telling me you should come home, but they were only going to let me go with 4 guards and belly chain, handcuff, and leg irons, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
said, I'm just not going to my family. I brought them enough shame, enough embarrassment. I'm not going to
Right.
my family that way. I'm just not doing it.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember, when you were up in the dining hall, sometimes the executive staff stood up against the back wall, and if you wanted to go up and ask the warden something, you could. And so Warden called me over and he said, You gotta go see your dad, And I said, I ain't going like that, Warden. I just ain't doing it.
Hmm.
And then, the next day, um, my dad died, and he said, You gotta go home for the funerals. You gotta go home. And I said, I ain't going like that, Warden. I just ain't doing it.
Right.
And then the next so that was at dinner. That next morning, the correctional officer came and got me at like 6:30 in the morning, woke me up and said, you're going. And
Mm.
I said, what do you mean I'm going? I said, they're going to give you a furlough. And
Mm.
so they gave me a 72-hour furlough, and they said, you got 72 hours, don't be late. And they gave me a cheap suit to wear and
Yep.
$50 out of my commissary account, and they had an
Yep.
airplane ticket waiting for me at the airport, and they called a taxi, and they let me out the door, and there I am standing. I'll never forget this day. My father's just died. I'm flooded with grief. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful blue sky day. There are these flagpoles in front of the prison. The flags are beating in the wind,
Yeah.
and I hadn't been out of that prison in 13 and a half years or whatever, and I was just I never felt that alive in my life, and at the same time just flooded with grief
Oh,
and
wow.
pain, and it was just an incredible experience. And then the taxi arrives, and it was this kind of grandmotherly woman who was the taxi, and I mistakenly, being friendly, got in the front seat with her, and it felt like she was driving 90 miles an hour to the airport, but I hadn't been in a car in 13 and a half years, right? And I
Right.
was like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Uh,
And then I get to the airport and I go into the bathroom and they got these things where you put your hands underneath it, the water comes out. I go, whoa, what's that?
yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we had TV, we kind of had a sense of the world, but some of those details,
Hmm.
and anyway, I did go home and was there for my father's funeral and with my
Good.
family, with my mom, and I stuck by her through the whole thing, got
Good.
back and and then I was released 5 months later.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that was, I was surprised that kind of caught me off guard because, I've been hearing for years from guys that went out and they came back and they talked about how they got screwed over in the halfway house, screwed them over. And, they always had a big victim story. And I used to always kind of think, I wonder what did you really do?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was kind of a little skeptical.
Sure.
And but I got to the halfway house myself. Now my a former girlfriend who'd been my best friend, who would become my best friend while I was in time. She moved on, I moved on, but she was a close friend. She and my son picked me up at the airport in Denver and drove me to Boulder, Colorado, where they took me to this halfway house. And I mistakenly went to the bathroom and peed just before I left the airport. So they get me to this halfway house and get in there, and right away they want me to do a urinalysis. They want,
Oh, man.
and so, I can't do it. And I always had trouble in prison anyway. Anytime they do it, it's kind of a shy bladder, they stand right next
Yeah.
to you and you're right. And I
Yeah.
can't do it. I can't do it. So I'm drinking water. I can't do it. I'm drinking water. And they tell you, you got, we get up to 90 minutes. We're going to call the marshals. You're going back to prison.
Oh, my.
And, so
Man.
I'm sweating, and it actually I went 2 hours and they didn't call the marshals, but I must have drank 3 gallons of water. And I finally was able to do it. And
Yeah.
then I'm up all night that night going to the bathroom and I can't
Oh,
sleep.
my
And
gosh.
and there were 2 guys snoring above me and beside me, so I hardly slept that night,
Yeah.
and when I left prison, I've been taking good care of myself, working out, staying in good shape. I remember looking in the mirror thinking, I'm 49, almost 50, but I'm not looking too bad,
Great.
but after that night, when I looked in the mirror, I suddenly looked like I was 70. I went, "Whoa," And But then I'm in that halfway house for 3 months,
Hmm.
and I realized that place is set up for you to fail.
Yeah.
There's nothing to support you. They have a rule book this thick, and they won't show it to you. They don't give you a copy of it.
Mm.
And the crazy things, like, you can't, once you can finally get out to to go to a job, you have to remember, like, with your job, even to go to the bathroom, you have to call them and say, "I'm going to the bathroom now." And then you got 10 minutes to go to the bathroom, get back. And if you're not, they could violate you. Or, before you come back to that house, you got to call them before you leave. And it just doesn't make sense. So I several times I forgot to call, and I'm just about to walk in halfway. I was like, oh shit, I didn't call. Can
Yeah.
I get back there and call, or go which way is going to, and you don't, and
Yeah.
I almost got violated. I had no chip on my shoulder. I had a really positive attitude, no resentment. I was committed to doing good. And yet I was on the edge of getting violated constantly. And I
Oh
had a
my
friend that
gosh.
bailed me out, because a friend who had a car and came pick me up here, picking me up, that bailed me out a couple of times, right? So I barely got through that. And then I went into house arrest, living at this Buddhist residence, kind of a place where about 20, 30 people live, and the focus was meditation. And there I had this day reporting thing where you had a phone monitor that could call you anytime, anywhere, and you scheduled out your whole week with a counselor at the beginning of the week, and you could never be more than 10 minutes off your schedule, and they could call you. So she called me in the middle of the night, and I didn't hear it. And when
Mm.
I got in the morning, I saw there was a message light on my phone, right? So I checked it up, boom, message, and she said, "No, you're going back. You're going back to prison." And fortunately, it was a weekend, and they were waiting for the director of that company, that was a for-profit company managing the halfway house and managing day reporting, was out of town. They were waiting, and by the time he got back and they got hold of the U.S. Marshals, well, actually, it wasn't the U.S. Marshals. It was I was still under control of Federal Bureau of Prisons, so they got hold of those people in Denver, and they said, "Well, you've been back on the clock now for almost 48 hours. We're not going to send you back, but they screwed up. You should be back in prison already." And so it was
Really?
kind of like that, but
Yeah.
I finally got off that. But I got really involved. I was lucky. I had nothing but opportunity once I got out of prison.
Good.
And I got my own consulting company going. I
Hmm.
worked really hard, and but I've had a lot of opportunities. And the first the striking thing when I first got out was the world was moving so fast.
Yeah.
For me, it was scary to cross the street at first.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, eventually I got used to it, but the world was moving so fast. But I'm really grateful that everything I did, and just led to so much opportunity. Like, I got out in 1999, and I've been traveling the world teaching. I mean, up until the pandemic hit, I've been traveling all over North America, South America, a little bit in Asia, a lot in Europe, a little bit in Africa, teaching and training, doing prison work. Today, one of my major activities is I train correctional officers, I train probation and parole officers, and I train police and other first responders in a model we call mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency, helping them work in a way that does less damage to themselves, because actually correctional officers that work in a secure facility for 20 years or more have a life expectancy 20 years less than the general population,
Wow.
because of all the high stress and trauma exposure,
Sure.
and that they don't have good coping skills, right?
Sure.
So today I get up in front of a room. I've been in front of rooms like there's 100 sheriff's deputies, and half of them are armed, or they're all armed. Half of them are in uniform. And I get up there to lead a day-long training with them, and I start off by telling them who I am. It's just like a pall goes over the room, and
Hmm.
I've dug myself in a hole, and I got to climb back out. But I get in relationship with them with a lot of humor and deliver the training. But I've had all these opportunities and been accepted into the worlds I would never. I'm considered a respected criminal justice professional now, and I was a convict, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So and all that has come out of living from the place of radical responsibility, living from choice. And it's not a
Yes.
burden, it's the golden door to opportunity. And it's really also a term that I've started using of late, that other people it's like personal sovereignty. We usually use the word sovereignty around nations, national sovereignty. Right now the whole issue of the national sovereignty of Ukraine is being seriously violated by this Russian invasion, right? So we talk
Right.
about,
Right.
but people also talk about sovereignty at the individual level. Like, how do we, take responsibility for our own choices and actions, the consequences they create for us, the impact we're having on others, but also be able to have good boundaries and so forth. it's about that sense of personal sovereignty that allows us to engage in the world in a really powerful way and really add value, right? So it has absolutely nothing to do with self-blame. The most important distinction when I teach radical responsibility is the distinction between blame and ownership. Because
Yes.
we've all
Yes.
been enculturated to believe that when something happens, somebody's got to be blamed. Somebody's got to take the blame.
Hmm.
Somebody's going to be blamed. And we've all been blamed enough in our lives and experienced all that shame. We don't want any more of that. We
No.
unconsciously, just instinctually deflect blame out there, right?
Hmm.
Because we're protecting us. We all have these tender, vulnerable hearts. We don't want to be blamed and shamed anymore, right?
No.
So, but radical responsibility has nothing to do with blaming ourselves. Obviously, has nothing to do with blaming others. And it's not about blaming victims either. It's about choice. It's about owning our choices and realizing, yeah, stuff happens. People are victimized. We may be victimized, and we may need to, vent and be validated for that. And but at some point, the most salient question is, what am I going to do? Am I going to let this thing take me down, or am I going to find the most creative way I can respond to this to move forward in my life, which might include seeking justice, but can I do that in an empowered way, not from the victim mindset, right?
Yeah.
So it's really about choice. And when I do look, part of it is looking at, like, maybe this circumstance I'm unhappy about, I had something to do with, right? Maybe I allowed it or created it or kind of collaborated with it, or maybe I'm consciously setting myself up. But I'm not looking at that to blame myself. I'm looking at that to learn. Because if I can understand how I got into a situation I don't like, I don't have to do it again. I can learn to do something else. But even if I can't see I had anything to do with it, at some point I can ask myself the question, well, what am I going to do? Here it is.
That's
What am I
right.
going to do with this?
Yeah.
And that's the only place I have any real power. Because when I focus on blame, even though there may be other people that contributed to a situation I'm in, right? If I focus on that, I'm basically giving my power away. Because let's say, Aubrey, let's say you and I have a business thing going on, and it blows up and we're ready to go to fisticuffs, right? Or we're lawyering up and our friend said, don't do that. You're going to end up in jail. You're going to spend all your money on lawyers. And I know this mediator, go see this mediator, right? So we do that reluctantly. And the mediator interviews each one of us. I don't know what, you guys are both incredible, compelling storytellers and salespeople. It's a he said, but I'll tell you what, we got the videotape, we're going to show that I got put together this focus group of some smart people. Don't Either one of you couldn't give a hoot about either one of you. We'll see what they say. Right. So comes back, brings us into her office and says, Fleet, I have to say, they agree that Aubrey really holds more of the responsibility here. So I'm glad to get found a brilliant group of people. They realize it's all Aubrey's fault. I could have told you that. And you go, well, no, they do say you had some of the responsibility. I said, well, I don't know. But as long as they agree it's mostly or all his fault. Well, they think it's about 70-30 or maybe 60-40. I said, well, okay, maybe I had some small role to play, but I don't think it went as high as 30-40%. But, okay, I'll own but as long as they agree it's all his fault. Now, and I feel vindicated. Well, does that really make sense? Because if
No.
I'm unhappy by definition, right, I'm really unhappy about a
Hmm.
situation. And if I'm convinced it's that you caused it, whether 30%, 40, 70, 60, whatever it is, who did I just put in charge of my internal state? Can I control you?
No.
No. So, I don't get to change my internal state until you change. And I can't control you. So I just put you in charge of me and my internal state, my happiness, my well being.
Yeah.
It seems very compelling. We all do it all the time, but it makes no sense at all. It's a complete wasteful use of my energy. Now, we may need to complain and get it, feel the emotion, feel the anger, but then at some point we got to take a big breath, let it go, and okay, what can I do? What's in my own enlightened self-interest here to move my life forward? Because that's the
Yes.
only place we have any real power, and that's hard enough. It's hard
Yep.
enough working with our own selves, right?
Yeah.
So it's really all about choice and living a choice.
Gotcha. Choice. Living a choice. My goodness, Dr. Maull, you've taken us on a journey of I heard all four cornerstones in your story that you shared with us. I heard self-awareness, I heard gratitude, I heard humility, I heard service to others. Such a journey, an amazing journey of accountability, reflection, ownership, and deflecting shame, right? And compassion for those inmates that had terminal illnesses that you volunteered as a as one of the founding hospice members in the facility to assist these gentlemen. A tremendous amount of compassion, as well as resilience, and realizing, that you can put your concerns aside, for the benefit of helping others. And of course, you're still managing your life and your emotions and your affairs, but just giving of yourself for the benefit of someone else, is one of the truest acts of thoughtfulness, and humanity. So I got to commend you for that, Dr. Maull. 100%, sir. How can the listeners learn more about you and connect with you, and just hear this amazing story of of your path?
Well, then go to my basic website, fleetmall.com. That's a good place to start. You can find out a
Okay,
lot there, and my podcast is there, and my
good.
books, and you can find all kinds of stuff. If you want to learn about the Radical Responsibility book, you can go to radicalresponsibilitybook.com, and
Okay.
you can read what other best-selling authors have had to say about it. And you can download a free chapter of the book right there.
Oh, great.
And right there, you can order the book from, through Indie Books or Amazon or wherever you want to order it from, right from that page, radicalresponsibilitybook.com. Most of my online courses and the big online summits that I do today, we just had the Global Resilience Summit last month. We have a big self-care summit coming up in May.
Hmm.
And I deliver the Radical Responsibility course. I have an online Radical Responsibility course. That all is through my company, Heart Mind Institute. And
Okay.
so that's heartmind.co, heartmind.co.
Heartmind.co.
If
Gotcha.
people are interested in the prison work, the work we do with prisoners is through Prison Mindfulness Institute. That's prisonmindfulness.org. The
Okay.
work we do with public safety professionals, first responders, is mindfulpublicsafety.org.
Hmm.
And then we also train mindfulness teachers in trauma-informed approaches to bring mindfulness to individuals and communities that have been placed at risk and marginalized and unresourced and where there's a lot of trauma. So we do that through another division of our nonprofit that's called Engage Mindfulness Institute, and that's engagemindfulness.org. So there's
Got it.
lots of different places, and probably you can kind of find your way there from fleetmall.com as a starting point.
Okay, that's very, very good to know. And we'll make sure that we'll have direct links to those sites, and initially with fleetmall.com, for the listeners. We'll have those direct links in the episode show notes. They can click the link while hearing this amazing conversation. What a journey. My goodness. I mean, and I can picture it in my mind's eye, Dr. Maull, every detail that you mentioned, from the moment you were sentenced to when you were in the halfway house and all the spots in between. So, Dr. Maull, I want to truly, truly thank you for your time and coming on to the show to chat, for our listeners today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Aubrey, and it's a pleasure to connect with you and with your audience. I hope it's a benefit.
Oh, an absolute benefit. Thank you so much, Dr. Maull. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening. And look, if you have a loved one, if you have a friend, a colleague, a coworker who seems to be going through dark days of despair, a dark period in their time, maybe low self-esteem, maybe, who knows, bankruptcy, addiction, a loss of a loved one, just really, really going through despair, I humbly ask that you please share this show with them, because on the road to rediscovery, we want our listeners to know two things. Number one, you're not alone. And number two, there's always hope. The road to rediscovery, it's a movement, a revolution. And guess what? You are now part of it. We're all roadies on this journey of life, and it sure feels good having you on the road with me. Thanks again for listening. We'll chat again soon. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of The Road to Rediscovery. We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email at roadtorediscoverypodcast@gmail.com and leave us any questions or comments you may have. The Road to Rediscovery is an AJ Shark production.